Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time at Southwest Park Baptist Church. We're continuing in our study in Proverbs. This week our lesson is entitled Pleasing God. God's people should seek to please Him in their attitudes and actions. Our larger scripture passage this week covers Proverbs 15 through chapter 22, verse 16. And in this long passage, Solomon continues to stress the clear difference between those who live to please the Lord and those who reject Him. The vast majority of this section follows a one-verse format. For instance, Proverbs 15:14 says that an intelligent person would pursue knowledge, but a foolish one would feast on indiscretions. The mind of the intelligent seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools feed on folly. There are some times in this lengthy passage where Solomon elaborated on some of these insights into godly wisdom. Proverbs 15:25 through 32, those 8 verses describe how the Lord will judge the wicked and strengthen the upright. The Lord will tear down the house of the proud, but He will establish the boundary of the widow. Evil plans are an abomination to the Lord, but pleasant words are pure. He who profits illicitly troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. The Lord is far from the wicked, but He hears the prayer of the righteous. Bright eyes gladden the heart, good eyes put fat on the bones. He whose ear listens to the life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. He who neglects discipline despises himself, but he who listens to reproof acquires understanding. Then our focal passage for this week is Proverbs 15, verse 33 through Proverbs 16:11. And in this passage, Solomon shows the value of living in a way that pleases the Lord. In Proverbs 16:12 through Proverbs 18:24, we've got a number of approaches for walking in the wisdom of the Lord. Right near the end of that passage is a familiar warning about the immense power of the tongue. Proverbs 18:20, from the fruit of a man's mouth, his stomach will be satisfied. As for the yield of his lips, it will satisfy. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love her will eat of her fruit. The last part of this passage invites us to consider some practical applications of God's wisdom to life situations, particularly friends and family. We're also reminded of the needs of the poor and our obligation to help. So there's a lot in those chapters 15 through about midway through chapter 22. In our focal passage, those 12 verses there, it's another one of those chiastic passages. So we're going to jump around here, and then we're going to finish with the central theme right in the middle of the passage. So we're going to jump in. In the first part of this passage, we're going to look at verse 33 in chapter 15 and then verse 8 in chapter 16. Proverbs 15:33 says, "The fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility." Up to this point, Proverbs has given us some clear guidance on how to be wise in the Lord and some of the ways that that wisdom can be put into practice in our lives. But if we're truly wise in the Lord, how are we going to know this? There's all kinds of alternative sources of so-called wisdom available to us. And naturally, some confusion might creep in about whether or not we have truly been granted God's wisdom. In this verse, Solomon tells us that we can know that we're receiving godly wisdom if it causes us to fear the Lord. As we've studied previously, that doesn't mean that God's presence terrorizes us, but rather it means that we recognize, respect, and honor who He is with our attitudes and our actions. Out of this, we gain a strong sense of joyful trust that comes from the recognition of His faithful love and His provision for us. All the way through Proverbs up to this point, we have seen this truth revealed about the importance, the significance of the fear of the Lord. In chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Chapter 2, the first 5 verses, my son, if you will receive my words, treasure my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. If you cry out for discernment, lift your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver, search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Chapter 3, verses 5 through 8, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him. He will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body, refreshment to your bones. Proverbs 8:13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance in the evil way. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Proverbs 14:2, he who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises Him. Proverbs 14:26 through 28, in the fear or reverence of the Lord there is strong confidence, and His children will have refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may avoid the snares of death. And then Proverbs 15:16, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. All of these verses clearly describe the attitudes and the actions that are necessary in our lives to demonstrate our fear or reverence for the Lord. And in Proverbs 14:25, we hear that in the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence. So we can know that we are gaining godly wisdom as we have that and demonstrate that fear of the Lord. The second part of that verse says fearing the Lord involves approaching Him with humility. Before honor comes humility. That means we recognize His power and authority and our utter helplessness. When we approach Him with sincere humility, He graces us with His loving presence and honors us by restoring us to a right relationship with Him. The concept of humility kind of shades off in various directions, but the central thought's freedom from pride. God humbles people to bring them to obedience. To humble ourselves is a condition of God's favor and His supreme requirement. The Bible tells us that God dwells with the humble. Isaiah 57:15, for thus says the high and lofty one, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with Him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Humility is encouraged. To the Greeks of that day, humility was weak and despicable, but Jesus made it the cornerstone of character. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, Jesus says. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In Matthew 18:4, Jesus called a little child to Him and set him in the midst of him and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 23:12, but he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus, by His humility, drew people to himself. Matthew 11:28 through 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Paul emphasized the humility of Jesus. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. Paul commanded us to be humble towards one another. Romans 12:10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. And then in Philippians 2:3 and 4, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but for the interest of others. Peter exhorted humility before the brethren and before God. 1 Peter 5:5 and 6. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you, be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. So there's a lot in this little verse right here, chapter 15, verse 33. Wisdom means fearing the Lord and humbling ourselves before him, and all that's wrapped up in that little statement. Verse 8 of chapter 16 goes with that. Better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice. That verse is a repeat of Proverbs 15:16. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. So the person that fears the Lord will live lives that are characterized by righteousness and justice. The little that's talked about in these verses is not necessarily abject poverty. It can refer to just a modest income. But the main contrast there is between righteousness and injustice. Unethical conduct tarnishes great gain and will be judged by God. The Believer's Bible Commentary says it's better to have a modest income which is earned honestly than to have vast revenues without justice or with fraud. Those who fear God believe that a little is much when God is in it, and that it's to be preferred to great revenues gained without the desire to glorify God in word and action. So this verse it's a call for us to carefully examine our perspective on what's important. Left to our own interpretation, we might reach the conclusion that God's promised provision for us means lots of money and possessions. When we're wise in him and reverence him, we understand that a right relationship with him and living a life that honors him is a priceless treasure. That kind of perspective flies in the face of conventional wisdom about wealth. When most folks think about being prosperous, they think about having great income. In their mind, this leads to a life of contentment. The truth is, physical wealth does not bring contentment, and that's particularly true when that wealth is gained by fraud or injustice. Second part of our passage is Proverbs 16, verse 1, then verses 4 and 5, and then verse 9. Chapter 16, verse 1 says, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. We like to make plans, and we often assume that we have the control necessary to bring them to fulfillment. An important part of growing as a follower of Jesus Christ is recognizing that the answer of the tongue is from the Lord, and fully appreciating the fact that God has to give us the ability to articulate and accomplish our plans. The name Lord, Jehovah or Lord, occurs 9 times in the first 11 verses in chapter 16. Man can plan, but the Lord is sovereign and overrules all man's words and plans for the accomplishment of His purposes. Balaam, for instance, wanted to curse the people of Israel, but the words came out as a blessing. Think of Caiaphas, who spoke beyond his own wisdom. Herod and Pilate, who conspired to do to Jesus what God had already appointed to be done. So, man plans, but God is the one that carries them through to fulfillment. The Lord, in verse 4, the Lord has made everything for His own purpose, or its own purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. The Lord gives us direction in keeping with His purpose, so it behooves us to acknowledge that and seek His will in anything that we undertake. Our innate foolishness leads us to develop plans that center on our purposes instead of His. We often give lip service to seeking out the Lord's purpose by superficially checking to see that we're not doing something forbidden without really focusing on discerning what God would have us do. Sometimes when we make our plans, we say, this is what I want to do, and then we kind of evaluate it and we say, well, there's nothing in the Bible that forbids that, so it must be okay. But we really don't consider, we really don't seek God's face to see what He really wants us to do. The proverb means that God has an end or a purpose for everything. There's a result for every cause, a reward or punishment for every act, and as he says here, He has ordained a day of trouble or evil for the wicked, just as He's prepared heaven for those who acknowledge Him and love Him. The Believer's Bible Commentary, everything the Lord has made has its destiny, and the destiny of the wicked man is destruction. God is sovereign in every life and in all of history. He sees all, weighs all, and in the end judges all. Even the wicked have a role in the divine program, and God keeps the wicked for the day of evil. R.B.Y. Scott sums up well the thrust of this proverb when he says, man proposes, but God disposes. God displays His power even through wicked people. Now, that's not teaching that God's the author of evil or the creator of evil, but rather that even those who practice evil serve His sovereign pleasure. Verse 5 says, everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Assuredly, he will not be unpunished. The Lord surely will bring down the proud of heart, those who arrogantly set themselves presumptuously against God. The second phrase explains what the Lord hating the proud means. One can be absolutely sure, as in a confirming handshake, that such people will not go free. The Lord will punish the wicked and the proud in heart. Verse 9 says, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. The Holman Christian translates this verse, a person's heart plans his way. A person's heart is a place where a person's plans take shape. So we decide the way we'll go based on what's in our heart. People who reject God decide based on what seems right to them. They invest in it and believe that it will bring them fulfillment. As we were reminded in verse 1, man goes to great length to plan his career, but the Lord alone determines whether those plans ever come to pass. Saul of Tarsus planned to persecute the Christian saints in Damascus, but ended up becoming one of them. Onesimus planned to leave Philemon forever, but God brought him back on better terms than ever. We read this verse, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Most of us perhaps can think back on times in our lives when we made plans and they didn't work out. Life took us in a different direction than we anticipated. And many times, maybe most of the time, that's better. I remember when I was first in the Air Force, many years ago, the Air Force had a program where they would send you to law school. They would pay for you to go to law school, and in return you committed to serve as a judge advocate for a number of years. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And so I took the law school admission test, and I got a good score, and I made all the applications, and you had to jump through a bunch of hoops, and you had to get recommendations from congressmen and all of those sort of things. So I went through all of that, and I thought, this is going to be great. This is right. Well, I didn't get selected, and I was pretty devastated by that. But looking back on that, 40-some years later, it's a good thing that I didn't, because I wouldn't have made a very good lawyer. That's just not who I am. And in hindsight, so I made my plans, but the Lord had a different plan. That's the way I choose to look at that. The next section of our passage is entitled Motives Matter. And we're going to look at chapter 16, verses 2, and then verses 10 and 11. Verse 2 says, all the ways of a man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the motives. This verse serves to remind us that we can easily deceive ourselves into believing that what we're doing is right. We may evaluate ourselves, our actions, and say to ourselves that we're pleasing the Lord. However, God knows what's truly in our hearts. He examines our heart and judges the purity of our motives. Thus Solomon says, the Lord weighs our motives, or literally, He weighs our spirits. The Lord alone, by His Spirit and Word, can evaluate our behavior because He penetrates our hearts and knows our motives. People might seem innocent in their own estimation, but self-deception and rationalization make this evaluation unreliable. That's from the Expositor's Commentary. The Believer's Bible Commentary says, a man's ways are his outward acts. He judges himself by them and pronounces himself pure. But God sees the motives and intentions of the heart. Psalm 19:12 says, who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. Max Lucado, in his Encouraging Word Bible, offers this on this passage. Solomon knew that when his actions and motives pleased God, God rewarded him with peace. When pride and greed entered his heart, he began to travel down the road to chaos and destruction. No matter what good we do, God knows our motivation for doing it. God judges our motives, not simply our actions. And He hates pride. I know a frog who had a real problem. His home pond was drying up. If he didn't find water soon, he would do the same. Word reached him of a vibrant stream over the adjacent hill. If only he could live there. But how could he? The short legs of a frog were not made for long journeys. But then he had an idea. Convincing two birds to carry either end of a stick, he bit the center and held on as they flew. As they winged toward the new water, his jaws clamped tightly. It was quite a sight. Two birds, one stick, and a frog in the middle. Down below, a cow in the pasture saw them passing overhead. Impressed, he wondered aloud, "Now who came up with that idea?" The frog overheard his question and couldn't resist a reply. "I did." And then when he opened his mouth, he fell. Don't make the same mistake. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Why are you good at what you do? For your comfort? For your retirement? For your self-esteem? No, deem these as bonuses, not as the reason. Why are you good at what you do? For God's sake. Your success is not about what you do, it's all about Him, His present and future glory. Are you fooling God? It can't be done. You can't just go through the motions. Is pride getting in the way? Live a genuine life of faith today by praying that God will guide your heart and mind, and then He will direct your actions. Verse 10 says, a divine decision is in the lips of the king. His mouth should not err in judgment. So now in this verse, in order to help his audience understand the importance of right motives, Solomon uses the illustration of the ideal king. In that day, the king's decree had the authority of God's verdict. God would guide the king with the knowledge of what was best for the kingdom. The ideal king would then take action based on God's revelation. By seeking God's wisdom and remaining true to it, the king would be kept from making a wrong judgment. In this illustration, the key element is the king's relationship with the Lord. If he devoted himself to listening to the Lord, the motives for his decisions would please the Lord. In verse 11, Solomon gives another illustration and another example of right motives. A just balance and scales belong to the Lord. All the weights of the bag are His concern. This example in verse 11 is directed at merchants who used dishonest scales and balances or manipulated the same to cheat their customers. Before customers used cash or coins, they brought gold or silver that had to be weighed to determine the value. Dishonest merchants used deceptive practices to collect a little more from the customer. A merchant's honesty says much about his motives. The honesty of the merchant is very much the Lord's concern. We have seen this in previous Proverbs. In Proverbs 10:2, ill-gotten gains do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Proverbs 11:1, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight. Proverbs 11:3, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the crookedness of the treacherous will destroy them. The Expositor's Commentary says that the Lord's the source of honesty and justice in all human enterprise. This proverb concerns weights and balances. The law of the Lord prescribed that they had to be just. If you look back in Leviticus 19:35, you shall not commit injustice in regulation, in measurement, in weight, or volume. You must have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. Shrewd people kept light and heavy weights to make dishonest transactions, as a modern individual might keep 2 sets of books. But the verse, using synonymous parallelism to stress the point, affirms that righteous and just measures are from the Lord. The Believer's Bible Commentary says, God maintains a bureau of standards. He determines honest weights and scales. When men deal in accordance with His standards, He approves and blesses them. Many years ago, I was teaching a lesson similar to this, And I came across a word that was new to me. The word is lagniappe, Lagniappe. It's a small gift given to a customer by a merchant at the time of the purchase. The word history there, it's in the passage from his memoir, Life on the Mississippi. Mark Twain calls his readers' attention to an American regionalism that he thinks deserves to be better known. Lagniappe. The story of lagniappe begins in South America. It ultimately comes from the word yape, to give more. That's from the Incan language. The word was borrowed into Spanish as a noun spelled napa, meaning bonus, a little something extra added as a gift. And the word then spread throughout the Spanish of the Western Hemisphere. Eventually, the Spanish phrase la napa, meaning the gift, entered the rich Creole dialect in New Orleans, where the whole phrase came to be thought of as a single word and acquired the French spelling lagniappe. That's probably more than you want to know about the origin of the word. But the word was then borrowed into the English of the region. Lagniappe continues to be used in the Gulf states, especially southern Louisiana, to denote a little bonus that a friendly shopkeeper might add to a purchase. And the example I saw was when a merchant was weighing grain or flour or something like that. When he got to the right weight, he would add a little extra scoop, just as lagniappe, just to make sure that the customer got a full measure. So that's a demonstration of the sense of this proverb here: a just balance and scales belong to the Lord. That's what the Lord wants, is an honest and full measurement. The last part of our passage today, verses 3 and verses 6 and 7, kind of give us the central idea. Blessing assured. Verse 3 says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established." That word that's translated commit is literally roll. Roll your works to the Lord. And the picture there is rolling your burdens onto the Lord. We find that also in Psalm 22:8. He trusts the Lord, literally commit to the Lord, let Him rescue him, let Him deliver him because He delights in him. Roll it onto the Lord. Psalm 37:5, commit to, or literally roll upon the Lord your way. Trust also on Him, and He will act. Psalm 55:22, cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be moved. The word portrays a complete dependence on God, accomplished with a spirit of humility and by means of a very diligent season of prayer. For our plans to succeed, we must have the Lord's approval. Not every plan that we have is pleasing to Him, as we've already talked about. But for those that are, this verse is a great comfort. The Believer's Bible Commentary says, the best way to ensure that our dreams and goals will be achieved is to dedicate our works to the Lord. J. Allen Blair advises, occasionally we find ourselves disturbed and depressed even in trying to do the Lord's work. Could anything be further from what God desires? God cannot work through anxious hearts. Whenever a Christian reaches this state, he should stop at once and ask himself, whose work is it? If it's God's work, never forget that the burden of it is His as well. You're not the important person. Christ is. He's at work through us. What should we do when things do not go well? Go to Him. Anything less than this is disobedience. Verse 6 says, by loving kindness and truth, iniquity is atoned for. And by the fear of the Lord, one keeps away from evil. The Expositor's Commentary says, faithfulness to the Lord brings freedom from sin. The first half of this verse speaks of atonement for sin. The second half, avoidance of sin. So from both sides, the stress there is on freedom from sin. The couplet love and faithfulness often characterizes the Lord, but here, in parallel to the fear of the Lord, it refers to the faithfulness of the believer. Such faithfulness brings atonement for sin, and we need to be careful there and clear in our understanding there. It does not mean that a person is saved by being merciful and truthful. Salvation is by grace through faith in the Lord. Only to the extent that mercy and truth are the signs of saving faith, or the demonstration of saving faith, can they be said to purge iniquity. The second part of the proverb is clear on the face of it. By trusting the Lord, men escape misfortune and calamity in their lives. Reverential fear of the Lord prompts the believer to turn away from evil doing. Verse 7 says, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. A life that pleases God will be above reproach and will find favor with others. That's part of God's plan for rewards. Now, as with most proverbs, they state a principle, and there are what we might look at as exceptions. And so the principle there that when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. We know that sometimes it doesn't work out that way. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, indeed, all those who want to live in a godly manner in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Evil people and impostors will progress to the worst, deceiving and being deceived. But the principle there is valid. As Barnes put it, goodness has power to charm and win even enemies to itself. One of my favorite historical characters is Abraham Lincoln. He was born not far from where I was born, and if you go to my hometown, one of the banks there in town sits on a lot that Abraham Lincoln's uncle lived on back in the 1800s. And I admire many of his attributes. He was wonderful at the art of self-deprecation, of not taking himself too seriously. And he had a great strategy for destroying enemies. He befriended them. He met Edwin Stanton as when Lincoln was a backwoods country lawyer living in Illinois. Stanton was a high-powered Washington, D.C. Lawyer, and he invited Lincoln to join him in the McCormick Reaper case that was set to be tried in Chicago. Very famous case. Never having served in such a prestigious position, Lincoln accepted the position and worked tirelessly preparing document after document, conducting research and all of this. What he didn't know at the time was that Stanton was only using Lincoln to make himself look good in the eyes of the Illinois judge who would try the case. In fact, not only did Stanton not have any use for Lincoln's work, he would not even associate with the man. He called him a giraffe. He called him a gorilla. He said, you don't need to go to Africa to capture a gorilla. We got one in Springfield, Illinois. So he was not kind to Mr. Lincoln at all. Lincoln eventually got the message and kind of receded from the legal team. That was in 1855. In 1860, that same giraffe-like Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States. Lincoln's political savvy didn't do anything to assuage Stanton of his low opinion of Lincoln. In personal letters to friends and even Union General George McClellan, Stanton said of the President, "He has no token of intelligent understanding." So there was certainly no love lost between the two men. But that didn't concern the President. He was focused on winning the war. The Civil War was going badly for the Union, and the War Department, based just up the street from the White House, was in absolute disarray. Logistics were sloppy, supplies were short, updates from battlefields were often sketchy. Advisors to the President recommended he appoint the man best suited for the job of Secretary of the War, Edwin Stanton. So Lincoln swallowed all his pride and did just that. After Stanton's appointment, Lincoln issued an authorization to the War Department for an initiative a congressman had proposed. Stanton refused to carry it out, saying that Lincoln was a fool for issuing it. "Did Stanton say I was a fool?" Lincoln asked the congressman when he reported back to him. "He did, sir," and repeated it. At which point Lincoln replied, "If Stanton said I was a fool, then I must be one, for he's nearly always right and generally says what he means." What could have been Lincoln's biggest blunder of the Civil War, appointing a known enemy to such an important post, turned out to be one of his best decisions. When Stanton joined the cabinet, Lincoln trusted him implicitly, spent more time with his Secretary of the War than any other cabinet member. Almost every day, he walked down the street to get updates on particular fronts. Sometimes spent the night in the telegraph office of the War Department waiting on updates from the field. The trust that Lincoln had for Stanton was well deserved. Oftentimes, Lincoln would not even read over military commissions that required his signature if he spotted Stanton's name on the ledger. Stanton's approval was good enough for Lincoln. His trust of Stanton began to change the two men's relationship. Stanton responded with unfailing loyalty. Disparaging words of Lincoln not only disappeared from Stanton's lips, but neither he nor any of his family members would tolerate a scornful remark of their beloved president. Where enmity once was, friendship blossomed. On the evening of April 9, 1865, upon Lincoln's return to Washington aboard the River Queen, it was Stanton who greeted him with a bear hug and informed Lincoln of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. 5 days later, on the morning of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died from the gunshot wound inflicted on him the night before while taking in a show at Ford's Theater. The famous words spoken upon Lincoln's death, "Now he belongs to the ages," are attributed to Stanton. Robert Todd Lincoln, the assassinated president's son, wrote that Stanton, for more than 10 days after my father's death in Washington, called every morning on me in my room and spent the first few minutes of his visit weeping without saying a word. Because Abraham Lincoln was willing to forgive and trust, he gained a friend, a very dear friend. So that's a good life example of what Solomon's talking about here in this verse. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. I had another, there's one more verse that's interesting, and we're out of time, so I'm going to forego my comments on it, but verse 31, "A gray head is a crown of glory. It's found in the way of righteousness." So just a word, if you're coloring your hair out there, that gray hair is a crown of glory, Solomon says. So take that to heart. I had a lot more I was going to say about that, but time doesn't permit. You're probably grateful for that. So see you next week.